Hi, everybody. Welcome to Elevated Perspectives, Critical Conversations in Cloud Computing. This is an event series on the latest cloud computing insights, trends, technical best practices for R&D teams in life sciences. And we present this today in collaboration with our AWS partner. I'm Michael Reiner. I'm the President and CEO of RCH Solutions with Phil Echelier, our Chief Technology Officer. And today we're going to talk about the evolution of a cloud environment as a company matures. So think about startups to mid-sized and possibly beyond. We're going to do this together with our special guest, Steve Lister. Steve is a senior manager and compute specialist for healthcare and life sciences at AWS. He is a longtime collaborator and friend of RCH. Steve, it's a pleasure as always to have you here with us. Can you tell us a bit more about your role, your background before we get started?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Phil. Very excited to be speaking today. So my role at AWS, I've been here about 3.5 years now. So I've managed the compute specialist team. So within our team, we're responsible for the business development. So identifying the challenges and trends around high performance computing, containerization, hybrid, and flexible computing, the use of Spot or alternative silicon, things like Graviton, Trainium, Inferentia. Just by way of background, I've been in sort of the R&D drug development space for about 30 years now, both in academia and commercial, both as a scientist and in IT in support of the scientific space as well. So very excited about this place.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. So folks, we're going to talk about 3 things today. We're going to kind of set the stage and do an overview of the business needs. Then we'll talk about things at a strategic level. And then finally, we'll leave you with some best practices and practical things you can apply to the challenges you're having. So as I mentioned, or we talked briefly, life science companies come in many shapes and sizes, from startups to mid-size through enterprise. They all have unique challenges, and collectively we've experienced all of them. So today I want to start off with Steve and Phil to talk about the startups and when they mature into a mid-sized company. So we've seen the startups, it's a bunch of people with a great idea of lots of scientific expertise. They do all the scientific computing work themselves, or perhaps the cloud work themselves for a while, and then they grow. And the next step is usually bringing that quote IT person, right? Or perhaps the MSP, the managed service provider, to get them going. And then it seems like they almost always hit a wall, and the wall may be organizational, it may be technical, both technical and scientific computing stance, maybe cultural, or maybe something else. So from your experience, start with Steve, what are the common characteristics, opportunities, and challenges the teams face as they evolve beyond that startup phase, kind of to the mid space?
Yeah, I think you hit on the subject there in terms of a lot of the scientists are some of the first to experiment in the cloud. So they build the workloads, they deploy the workloads without really at the time thinking about, so what's the long-term aspect of this? Can I reproduce these results? How's this data going to grow? So we see a quick limit to how far they can go in this space, and then you have to start paring this back. So they may start with an ad hoc pipeline for genomics or imaging, and then you get stuck. And one of the recommendations we give to a lot of organizations is really start to think about what are the business objectives you're trying to achieve first. Like, what are the longer term objectives? So as a drug development company or drug discovery in healthcare life science, what are those long-term goals, and work backwards from those? And a lot of this comes down to, a lot of prescriptive guidance as well within the organization. And I think that's what, some of the areas that we've seen. But really focusing on those business objectives is key.
Okay. Hey, Phil, how about you? You have a lot of experience doing this. You see any common characteristics or challenges the teams face?
Yeah, I think one of the harder things that we have to tackle is that, the smaller companies, the startups, they'll start with something very elemental, probably a single AWS account, and they really do great science, but they're kind of limiting themselves in terms of scale and extensibility. And when we meet companies that are getting closer to that mid-size, or they're growing quickly, we talk about a multi-account model. We talk about a strategy for growth, for extensibility, for scale. And I think the harder thing to do is to convince them that it's time to make that commitment, because right now it's working fine right now. I don't have to worry about it. So, they want to kick the can down the road, but the longer they defer it, then the harder and more expensive it is to make that cut over.
Okay.
And I think I'd say, you know, one of the common challenges we see as well in that space is they may not engage security compliance early enough in the process.
Yeah.
Security compliance are your huge friends in this space. The earlier you can engage with them, the better it is for everybody involved. That will really accelerate that move.
Yeah, good point. Hey, Steve, while I have you, and I'll flip it over to Phil. We were still talking about the cloud and cloud computing needs as a company. The science matures. We have a lot of recent experience beyond just R&D and development now into the commercial phase, right? Because for all intents and purposes, in the mid-size and startup, they're really close, right? And they're moving really fast. What advances do you see, or can you see, that help them through the stages of development toward commercialization as it relates to the public cloud?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of areas, and having been in this space for about 30 years in IT, and to me, it's all about putting those foundations in place. So when we think about authentication, authorization, that's just a given from R&D all the way through to commercial. Whether you're using LDAP or Active Directory, you think of that as a foundational piece. So start to look at bringing those foundational pieces in, and where we're beginning to see a lot of that now, especially going into commercial, is the adoption of containers, for example. So taking it from those containers within R&D, it could be genomics and imaging, but really beginning to containerize that whole workload now through commercialization, websites, and that gets into that whole reproducibility perspective as well. So again, if you're thinking of that containerization, that just becomes one of those foundation pieces. The same with data management. So we start to look at multimodal data, that data coming back from the loop from research into development, then into the manufacturing, into commercial. So it's all interlinked, and having that sort of longer term view of what you're going to do with this data and how you're going to access it and who accesses it, I think is incredibly important. You don't have to solve it all on day one, but when you're thinking about what that strategic plan is for the business, start to think about how to address that.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Hey, Phil, can you think about anything else, how their needs would change and they move to the stages, say, from development toward commercialization?
Yeah. So I mentioned the multi-account model just a couple minutes ago, and that will help with scale and limiting the blast radius. But it's also a real critical component to implementing a multi-governance model. And as you mature, development's going to be a little bit more rigorous than discovery, and then you get into clinical, and you're faced with some GXP confines. You really don't want a single governance model where your GXP compute is slowing down your innovation layer. So being able to separate things out and manage them accordingly, the workflows are going to be there. You got to manage the data, but you want to do it where nothing is rate limited.
Okay. I want to ask you guys about the difference between the public and private cloud and how you view the advantages and adoptions, but I'll share a story that Phil and I have experienced multiple times, and I'm sure Steve has too. But we're invited into a meeting, and if you're fortunate, you get all the stakeholders in there. And I'm talking about a startup or a mid-sized company, and it's the business people, it's the technical people, it's the commercialization, the clinical folks, the folks that are doing the submissions. And ideally, what made me think of it was what Steve said about getting early buy-in on security, and that would be the legal people. And I can't tell how many times we walked in and we asked the perspective on the cloud, and most of the time it always points to the cloud as being a vendor solution or a point solution. And you sit back and you kind of bite your tongue, because you think a lot of these people came from big pharma, where in order to get their work done, they had to be insular, they had to create almost a silo for themselves. And they went to this small startup company, and they think, I've got all this liberty to do all these things, and they realize they fall back in the habits of creating silos. I'm not suggesting that a vendor solution is a silo, but what we recommend more often than not is let's see if we can address all the needs of everybody instead of creating these different silos and different clouds, and put a platform in place, the proper foundation that you can build upon. And most of the time it really resonates, but a lot of it is you have to educate people. So I'll start with Steve and ask, how much of your work is in education to that? And then how do you view the adoption and advantages of public cloud / AWS versus, say, a private cloud?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think the training and education is key, not just for the cloud piece and upskilling of people, but for retaining people, talent, acquisition as well. I mean, this is, you know, an emerging space. There's some amazing science and amazing technology in this space. So from that piece alone, from a scientist or an IT perspective, so driving that training and education. And then, you know, private versus public, I also don't differentiate. I think of the cloud continuum, and you're building the most optimal solution for the problem you have.
Okay.
If that's on-prem for data visualization, where you've got latency issues, or it's in some larger space where cloud, where data is growing at 100 or 500 terabytes a day, and it's how do you adjust that environment that's going to be optimal for you to achieve your business objectives. So I don't tend to differentiate between the public and private. I think there's parts that you just need to scale for the agility and the flexibility, which we saw in buckets over, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Things just had to scale and work.
Yeah.
Over that 3-year period.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, Phil, how about you? How do you look at it? Do you look at it the same way? Do you look at it a little bit differently between the public and private cloud?
Yeah, I do look at it a little bit differently. I mean, the private cloud has its place, as Steve was mentioning. If you want that flexibility of what you could do in an environment and, you know, automated orchestration, private cloud internally has merit, and you don't have, you know, it's shorter time to ship your data, but you got limited scale. You don't have one of the advantages of the public cloud is you shut it off, you're not using it. But if you shut off a private cloud, you already paid for the equipment, so you're not really getting that advantage. But, you know, when you look at what you can do with a traditional private cloud on-prem, it's really limited compared to what you can do in a platform like AWS. The whole ecosystem with the breadth of services. I don't want to come across as salesy, but you have a lot more tools in the toolbox.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we're approaching that scale. If I take virtual screening, for example, you know, it used to be we do make 1 million molecules a day. And that would take you 6 months to actually get through that cohort of data. Now you could actually do, you know, 10 billion molecules a day. You've got a large cohort of data that's all been run against the same target. Now you can actually start applying some of those advanced supervised or unsupervised machine learning techniques around it. So I think that's one of the changes as well. But that advantage of scale, like you just triggered that when you mentioned that, Phil. That's definitely one of the things we've seen. The change is much larger data sets to apply more advanced machine learning techniques against that data, looking for insights. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the technology is always going to outpace the organization. Something newer and better and faster is coming through. So, which leads me to my last question in the kind of the business overview. Steve, I'll start with you. What role does organizational culture play in success of companies as they work through these decisions?
It's huge. I mean, having buy-in from the top down, I think is incredibly important. I think also from the bottom up, in that if this is something you're going forward, we actually have a leadership principle at Amazon called, you know, show backbone, disagree, and commit. So not everybody may be on the same page, but if this is a direction you're going to go in, then disagree all you want. But once you've made that direction, you move into cloud, like fully adopt it, go 100% in. And support your colleagues, support the science. Culture-wise, I think you have to make that leap. You go in and you support it fully, both bottom up and top down. I think that's so important.
Show backbone. If you got a problem, step up, voice your concern. Hey, Phil, how about you? What role does the organizational culture play in all this?
Yeah, so you know, my thunder's already been stolen, because I'm a big believer in top down, and that you want to set direction and get corporate buy-in at all levels, and you need cohesive direction too. It just can't be a direction. You know, I hadn't really put a lot of stock in the bottom up. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and it's a very valid point. But I also look at the merit of being aligned horizontally across the teams. There has to be a collaborative nature. Points for integration that aren't cumbersome, sharing data, you know, not duplicating work. So it's all about the, you know, a lot of what we do at RCH is, you know, you want to come into work and get something done, feel valuable, and go home at the end of the day feeling good. And if the corporate culture where you're, you know, startup emerging is more competitive than collaborative, you're not going to get that same synergy.
Yeah, that's a good segue into our second part, which is talk about the challenge more at a strategic level. I said earlier, we got lots of experience with startups and the emerging mid-size. They all have the same energy, the passion and drive that brought them there, which is exciting and fun because you can all get, including us with them, get a lot done, which is the goal of advancing science. And some of the limiting things that we see are everything looks doable and fun, right? We agree they're all challenged and prioritizing things. They're torn on which tools to use, who's going to get them, make them work. But most of all, I believe they're looking for someone to take ownership and tell them what to do. So oftentimes it's us, right? It's RCH and AWS because they're coming to us say, you guys are the ones that've done this. So tell us what we should be doing so we can focus on our science. So Phil, I'll start with you. How do you guide the teams and the companies in making these strategic IT computing decisions, especially as they go through the different growth phases, considering all the challenges that happen in the development of the company?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. So this is kind of alluded to this earlier, but if I think about this kind of like fishing. If you're going fishing and even have the right bait, but the fish aren't hungry, they're not going to bite. So if the corporate management or the customer doesn't have the appetite to buy in, that all the guidance in the world is going to fall on deaf ears. But to me, guidance it's really it's not just strategic, it's a balance between tactical and strategic. Tactically, here you want to set up this environment, support this workflow. You want to get this work done, but you don't want to make a decision today that is going to collide with where you got to go more strategically tomorrow or the next day. So telling the story, justifying your perspective, and helping them not make decisions that will get in their, help them get out of their own way is really important.
Steve, you're the expert. You've been around a long time. I'm sure they ask you this. How do you guide these teams to make the strategic IT and scientific computing decisions as they go through their different phases?
Yeah, especially in the life science side. So I always come at this from the scientific perspective. So, what's that drug company trying to do? It's trying to develop better therapies for patients more optimally. And it's how do we help them achieve that goal or achieve their business objectives more efficiently? So I typically start from that perspective. And if we've built a framework or a solution, it could be like virtual screening or cryo-electron microscopy, we've developed at least a framework to get a customer 50 to 80% of the way there. Okay. So take away a lot of that heavy lifting, here are the benchmarks, here's cost models, start there, and then at least you've got a foundation to go up or down from there. And I think that helps as well. So it shows that you understand the science, you understand what their business is and how we're there to help them. This is not us selling things to them, it's how do we help them achieve their goals. And I think that's worked pretty well over the years. I remember years ago when I was in pharma and groups would just come to me with building blocks, and I'm already working, I'm 100% committed to supporting what I had on premises. So developing something that's new and novel is very difficult for that team. You're 100% committed. So anything that could help accelerate that, show me the impact to the business, has been incredibly helpful to me when I was on that side, and finding now with customers from this side.
Okay. Hey, Steve, let me follow up with another question. We talk about strategically. What can people or teams keep in mind? What can companies keep in mind when they're building out the teams that support the scientists? And I'm talking about the operational teams, the technical teams, maybe the financial teams. But what should they keep in mind when they build out the teams going from 2 people in a garage to 150, 200 people?
Yeah, I think that variation in skill sets in terms of, compute, it's interesting. So, I've come really from a high performance computing background for many years. And in that space, you tended to need to know storage, compute, network, application optimization. So it was a catch-all. And I think having that diversity across teams who can challenge each other and drive each other is incredibly important. And again, if you've got a couple of people within that team who maybe have come from a scientific background who know that, can help drive that discussion as well. But to me, it always has to link back to the science and understanding the scientific aspects and what they're trying to achieve, and then building the IT systems around that to support them, I think is so important in that space.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier about what we've seen. I'm sure you have. They immediately fall into building these silos, and the silos get further and further apart, and then you all of a sudden fall into that problem you have with a big company, which is nobody's talking about it. IT's over here and the business is over here. And it's because not only they have different goals, but they're just not talking the same language. And if you can have that ability to have some people on each side or a broker talk to both of them, it just makes things so much easier.
I think that's why, partners are incredibly important in this space. Partners accelerate these initiatives. They initially give you that training bump, that education, they get you going, it gives you time to think. So, working with groups like RCH, for example, really helps accelerate that adoption. And it's an invaluable addition. It really is.
Great, thank you. Hey, Phil, how about you? Anything you can suggest they keep in mind when they're building out these teams? Again, it can be operational, technical, financial, whatever.
Yeah, so as far as the teams go in the IT space, I mean, we have level one, people who will do help desk tasks, reset passwords, and they have a very important place in the organization. But we start looking at the innovation layer in life sciences. To me, it's the DevOps, it's the cloud ops model. You have a handful of people that are highly skilled, cross-functional IT, and you can get far more done with 3 or 4 people than a team of, you keep using the word silos. You can have network experts and DBAs and maybe a team of Linux admins, but without that cross-functional IT expertise, you spend a lot of time trying to educate each other or maybe hitting walls with each other. So I'm a big fan of cross-functional IT, keep it small, be agile, move quickly.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to move on to our last section, which is technical recommendations and best practices. Back to my earlier comment about needing strategic guidance, I'd like to focus on strategic technical guidance if we can. So again, who should be telling what to do and what recommendations or best practices we offer? Phil, I'll start with you. How can an AWS environment be customized to meet specific requirements from early discovery through to, again, therapeutic commercialization?
Yeah, so we've hit on a lot of this already, but it's looking at the multi-account model for multi-governance so you're not hindered as you progress through your evolution. But AWS is a set of platform services that are building blocks, and they're incredibly valuable, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You kind of glue them together, and if it doesn't work, you glue them together a different way. So to me, it's about compartmentalizing workflows so you don't step on each other, but you want the federation for easy communication. And again, so this type of platform leveraging building blocks as a platform service is just the way to go. It goes all the way from engineering through ops.
Okay. Hey, Steve, you touched on data earlier on, so I want to kind of bring it back to that. If we talk about data management, are there strategies and maybe tools that are effective in maintaining that integrity and accessibility and reusability and security of data in AWS?
And this is one of my, I don't know if it's a pet peeve area, but this is something I've been highly passionate about for many years, and it's the data management aspect. And even before, any cloud migration, thinking back to that first question, in terms of business objectives, also what's the data strategy? So I think over the years, file system, for example, has been incredibly useful. It's now, to me, becoming an impediment to scientific insight. So as you start moving into that 10, 50, 100 petabytes of unstructured data on a file system, and you're now trying to do multimodal analysis across your genomics, your imaging data, say your computational chemistry data, that is really difficult to put together. So I think from a technical perspective, really starting to think now about how you organize your data using object stores with extensible metadata. So now you can start to pull data from different verticals, which can go from R&D through to commercial into clinical and manufacturing, and having a structure around that and minimizing the amount of data that ends up in a file system where you've got minimal number of attributes around, POSIX attributes, access time, create time, and you're very limited in what you can do to pull out more of those scientific insights from that data. So having a data management strategy and a data classification strategy is got to be one of those foundational pieces where you start in this.
Stephen, in the data management strategy, so I'm thinking of a company that, again, startup, small, they're emerging, And to do their clinical work, they're utilizing a lot of CROs and partners, maybe several. So their data resides in several places. It's growing. So you've got management issues from security to access to scalability. When does a company get to the point where they decide we should bring this in-house, meaning get control over it for an on-prem solution or leverage AWS cloud? Like, what is that inflection point? And then are there any strategies you can recommend where they can ensure a seamless transition to do that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the CRO conversation and collaboration conversation, going back to an earlier question in terms of the agility of cloud in order to move things forward in a more flexible manner. And that's where, that CROs, especially, whereas that data is coming in-house, cryo-electron microscopy, genomics, is a lot of that scientific workloads are outsourced. But as organizations mature and they've got the space internally to bring those workloads internally, but I think you still also have to maintain that collaboration with either partners or CROs. And again, having a strategy around what that metadata should look like, whether it's internal or external, whether you work with the CROs and collaborators to come up with a standard in that space, is incredibly important moving forward. And again, that's one of those pieces you can just keep leverage on, rinse and repeat. So this is my standard. I'd like you to provide this in this standard. Or if it's not in a standard format, make sure when that data is coming through into your storage systems or data mesh, it is standardized before it goes into any of those structured data platforms. Okay. It's so important.
Thank you. Hey, Phil, how about you? Comments on bringing it in-house, managing it?
Yeah, so I think Steve made a lot of good points. I don't want to reiterate that, but one of my pet peeves is SaaS, software as a service. It's very compelling to organizations to have a fully managed application stack, data management stack. It's like, fine, set it, forget it, we don't have to worry about it. But remember, data is the asset, and really what you want to do is you want to have it under your own umbrella for your own use cases or down the road. And the big down the road use case these days is data science and AI. And if your data's, peppered across different SaaS providers, you're going to have a hard time pulling it together for real AI work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, can you, while I got you, Phil, as we wrap things up, can you recommend some key takeaways for the folks listening, considering how they mature their AWS environment as they grow?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway is what I opened with. It's like talking to people and having a stakeholder say it's working today, I don't have to worry about it, we'll do it later, don't wait, get your architecture in place, get your data management strategy in place. You don't want to wait until you're up against resource limits in an AWS account. You don't want to make it like days of old in Steve was mentioning, the petabytes in a NAS. I mean, that's not a data lake. That's not anything. That's a cesspool. You want to get it to where, it's consumable and scalable.
Okay. Hey, Steve, how about you? You've seen a lot. Anything you've seen which maybe not be a best practice and something you would do differently?
I've made many of those mistakes. Yeah, I mean, sometimes not the latest and greatest technologies, the best to go out and purchase. So test the environment, test that you can actually utilize it in an optimal manner wherever you deploy. I think that's really important. Reproducibility. I think the big one for me is you have to think about how I'm going to reproduce this result in 1 year or 20 years, especially in this space. So really starting to think about how we've organized that data with the application stack and how that's going to move forward over the years. Even basic things, operating system upgrades. These are major undertakings, and in a clinical setting, that could change, a number of decimal places, and all of a sudden that's going to throw off a clinical trial. So really thinking of what that long-term strategy is, and making sure you test and validate and automate as much as possible. It's amazing. Like, just infrastructure as code, applications as code, workload as a code. That CI/CD approach. So this reproducibility, reusability is key.
Yeah, I think that's real important. And while maybe at the innovation layer, containers are considered, maybe rate limiting or a bottleneck as far as performance, but down the road in that pipeline, you're going to preserve something, stick it in a container, come back tomorrow, it'll still be there.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Great. Gents, any final thoughts, recommendations before I wrap up?
I think one thing to emphasize again, this is the partnership, look at partnership to help accelerate where you maybe have gaps in that organization or skill set. One of the best way to partner with ourselves and I say it's just really hone in on what that particular use case is and accelerate that. Get early wins. I think that's big. Early wins to show the power of what you're trying to do, the power of your vision goes a long, long way.
Yeah. You're preaching to the choir. We recommend companies bring us on. It's what should we tackle first? Let's tackle something. Let's get a success and build upon it. And you'd be surprised how many times they work with a generalist who wants to tackle everything, and then they end up doing everything spectacularly average. Versus, let's get real specialized. Let's pick up something we're really good at it and knock it out of the park. All right. Hey, guys, I want to thank you both, Steve and Phil. I appreciate your time. Folks who are listening, we have this and previous episodes saved at our website, rch.com at Elevated Perspectives. And I invite you all to tune in for future episodes. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you guys.